Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Colson-Hurley, a journalist who covers climate change for Bloomberg News. When it comes to giving us joy, comfort, and basic sustenance, nothing is as essential to humanity as food. Yet the world's food system is in crisis. Hundreds of millions of people experience hunger. Food insecurity has been rising from economic and geopolitical shocks. And agriculture is making the planet sicker as climate change accelerates, with grave risks for society. But today, we'll be talking about the recipe for a future that's more sustainable and just. The new World Bank report, Recipe for a Livable Planet, shows how the world can significantly lower emissions from the agri-food sector to safeguard the climate, while also nourishing a population that will soon reach 10 billion. The report is a detailed framework for getting agri-food to net zero. And food is the greatest untapped source of climate action. Today, May 22nd, is also the International Day for Biological Diversity. So a fitting time to note that transforming food production will have major benefits for ecosystems and animal species, as well as for the climate. 50% of global GDP depends on nature, after all. We'll learn about the key findings of the report from one of the authors in a few minutes. After that, 4 speakers will give short Ignite talks identifying big picture challenges and solutions. Then we'll have a panel discussion with experts to drill down on how to move from ideas to implementation. This event is being live streamed on World Bank Live. If you're watching online and have questions, there are experts standing by for the next hour or so who can answer for you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jürgen Vergela. He will deliver some short remarks. Dr. Vergela is the World Bank's Vice President for Sustainable Development. He's also a longtime expert on agriculture, so this is a topic that's very dear to him.
Well, hello and good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to all of you in Washington, D.C. Thanks for coming from afar, including as far as New Zealand, as I've just learned, so makes us very happy. Also, a very warm welcome to all of you that are watching on World Bank Live. This is a hugely, hugely important topic that is unfortunately still misunderstood in a large part of the world. People do not understand that the way we produce, treat, and consume our food is profoundly unsustainable. And it's got to change. If we want to get ahead on climate, we need to change the way we manage our food system. It needs to be transformed from a major cause of disease, biodiversity extinction. You just mentioned the biodiversity link, very obvious, climate emissions, into a positive force. It is the only sector, when you think about it, that has the capability to transform itself from a massive net emitter to a real net sink. And the good news is we don't need 20 more years of research to understand what it will take. We actually do know what to do. The problem is we're not doing it. In fact, we're doing the opposite. Instead of promoting and supporting climate-smart agriculture and food systems, we are putting $600 billion into the food system that does exactly the opposite. That produces food that emits more than it needs to, that produces food that makes people unhealthy, that promotes systems that really undermine biodiversity. It's hard to explain to intelligent people why we're doing this, but you know, we're all struggling with these global issues. But this one is a really tough one to understand, because it really isn't rocket science. There are clear answers and solutions, and the report, Recipe for a Livable Planet, lays out many of them. They're in the policy space, they're in the technology space, there are innovations out there, there are financing out there. If we just repurpose a fraction of the $600 billion every year, instead of making the climate worse and the environment worse, and turning them into a force that makes the climate better and the people healthier, we would already solve partly the problem. It is not like other sectors where you don't have the money. There is money there in the sector right now that is not being used for the right purpose. So this report makes that case among many others. We really need to act on this. And the good news is you don't need to build a power plant which takes 10 or 15 years to design and construct. You can tomorrow, in the next season, already change the way you produce your rice. You can reduce methane by 30, 40% if you just do alternative redding and drying. We're at the World Bank now putting billions of dollars behind this, literally walking the talk, putting the money where the mouth is, and it's immediately take up in East Asia and on a very, very significant scale. You can start feeding your cattle wherever you are a tiny supplement that reduces methane emissions by a third. It costs next to nothing. It costs less than 1 cent per liter of milk produced, and it has a massive, immediate, positive impact. So if there is one message I hope you can all walk away from after today's session, is don't think it can't be done. It can be done, and it can be done fast. And if it's not done, let's be very clear, we will not reach our climate goals. There is no path to global net zero unless the food system is a part of it, and it's a significant part of it, because it's a third of the problem. And it can be more than a third of the solution. So let me just make that very clear. I want to thank all our panelists who have come and will speak later, our Ignite speakers. We have a lot of partners in crime, Gunhild, Dr. Stordalen from the EAT Foundation. You and I have been on this journey for several years now. A phenomenal report several years ago from the EAT Lancet Commission, where for the first time they tackled the question, what will it take to feed 10 billion people within our planetary boundaries, including climate and the rest of the environment, on a sustainable basis and on an affordable basis? And the conclusion was already years ago, it's doable. It doesn't mean we have to stop eating meat. It doesn't mean we have to change everything we do. It just means we have to act rationally, not throw 1/3 of what we produce away. I mean, who else does that? Who else does that? I mean, think of a TV manufacturer. He produces 100 TVs and throws 30 out over the next few years, just before they're even used. Just chuck them out. That's what we do with food. It's complete madness, right? And so we've done a lot of work, a lot of analysis, and now beginning to connect the dots. What policies need to be in place? What are the priorities? How do you act internationally, regionally, locally, in the community, in the household, as a consumer, as a producer? It's all there. But what we need is all of you to be champions, ambassadors, and be out there and make it happen. So with that, let me thank you, and I look forward to the event.
I'd now like to introduce Bill Sutton. He is the global lead for climate smart agriculture at the World Bank and co-author of Recipe for a Livable Planet. He's going to walk us through some of the top line findings of this major report. Bill?
Look you up. Hey. Hello, everyone, and many thanks to Jürgen and Amanda, and welcome to everyone who's joined us here in person in the room, as well as all of those people joining online on World Bank Live. I'm really excited to be here today and share with you some of the key findings of our new global flagship report, Recipe for a Livable Planet, Achieving Net Zero Emissions in the Agri-Food System. So first, why are we interested in agri-food system emissions? The agri-food system is caught in a vicious circle, and adaptation alone is not sufficient to feed the world. So we're increasing agri-food activities in order to feed a growing population. That results in higher greenhouse gas emissions, which in turn contributes to increased global heating, which reduces agricultural yields, and to compensate for that, we increase agri-food activities again, which generates yet more greenhouse gas emissions. So there's increasing consensus that we need to break this vicious circle and promote both adaptation and mitigation measures so that we can create a more sustainable food system that will both feed the planet and also create a healthier planet for everyone. So some of the key findings of the report include the fact that greenhouse gas emissions from the agri-food system are significantly higher than previously thought. As the bar on the left shows, that's total annual global greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. The agri-food system contributes about 16 gigatons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions every year. That's about a third of the total, and to put that into perspective, that's approximately 1/6 more than all of the emissions from all of the electricity and heat production globally combined. On the right, we have a pie chart that provides a breakdown of the agri-food system emissions by different categories and sources of emissions. In orange, you have the farm gate emissions. That's what we normally think of as agricultural emissions from producing crops and livestock. That's the biggest category of emissions, but at about 45%, it's still less than half the total. The next, second biggest category is actually pre and post-production processes. That's everything from input manufacturing to processing, retailing, household consumption, and food loss and waste. That's the blue shaded areas and constitutes about a third of agri-food emissions. And then finally, in green, we have greenhouse gas emissions from land use change linked to agriculture. That's also very important, and in fact, the single biggest source of agri-food emissions is deforestation linked to agricultural production. So this points together to the importance of looking at the whole agri-food system when assessing emissions and also coming up with mitigation solutions. The next point, something that I think Jürgen also highlighted, without significant climate mitigation action in the agri-food system, the Paris Agreement goals cannot be reached. So this figure shows the cumulative global emissions pathways going forward from now to the end of the century. The red line at the top, that's what's projected to happen if we eliminate all emissions from fossil fuels by the year 2075. But in the agri-food system, we continue with business as usual, emitting the way we have been. That alone will be enough to drive the planet past the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement target and even put the 2-degree target in serious jeopardy. So the green line at the bottom, that shows what is projected to happen if we can get agri-food emissions down to net zero by 2050. That's what we need in order to have at least a 50% chance of achieving those Paris Agreement targets, and thus the theme of our report. One of the interesting features of the Recipe for a Livable Planet report is the approach that we took, and that includes carrying out the analysis and providing recommendations by country income categories. Here you see a figure showing greenhouse gas emissions from agri-food systems in low, middle, and high-income countries. And what it reveals is that over 2/3 of agri-food emissions, or about 68%, come from middle-income countries, with about 22% coming from high-income countries and 11% coming from low-income countries. This shows their emissions from 30 years ago and today, and it reveals a number of important points. First of all, if we want to really have an impact on climate change, we should focus efforts on those middle-income countries that are responsible for the lion's share of emissions. Second, the fastest growing category is those blue shaded pre and post production processes. We have to look at those, not just at the farm. And finally, we have to help low income countries avoid the mistakes of the past. But despite its importance for climate change, finance for mitigation in the agri-food system is strikingly low. In this figure, you have the big blue circle. That's total annual global climate finance, which is about $660 billion a year. The slightly smaller light blue circle, that is mitigation financing, and that's about 90% of total climate finance. Then you come to those much smaller green circles. That's the climate finance for the agri-food system. And despite its importance, only 4% of total climate finance goes to the agri-food system currently, and the figure is even lower for mitigation, with only 2% of mitigation financing going to agri-food, despite the agri-food system being responsible for 1/3 of emissions. So we need to close that massive financing gap, and to do that, there are far greater opportunities to access financing on the mitigation side, which again is 90% of the total financing available economy-wide. But there is good news, and the good news is that the agri-food system is a huge untapped source of low-cost climate change action. This figure shows the cost-effective annual mitigation potential by the different country income categories, again, low income, middle income, and high. And as you can see, middle-income countries hold 3/4 of the cost-effective mitigation opportunities through agriculture, forests, land use, and demand-side measures. The technologies to do this are readily available, and some are actually cost-saving, things like more efficient use of fertilizer and water. And finally, we find that there is no inherent trade-off between mitigation on the one hand and food security on the other, because agriculture's triple wins can help break the vicious circle of climate in the agri-food system that we talked about in the beginning. So the Recipe for a Livable Planet report provides much more detailed recommendations, a much more detailed roadmap for getting to net zero in the agri-food system that's been provided before, with specific doable recommendations by country income category. High-income countries can lead the way through by promoting renewable energy in agri-food. They can provide more financial and technical support to low and middle-income countries, and they can shift subsidies towards low-emission foods. Middle-income countries have the greatest potential. As I mentioned, 3/4 of the cost-effective mitigation potential is in middle-income countries. That includes reduced conversion of forests and promote reforestation and agroforestry, cut methane in livestock and rice production, manage soils more sustainably to store more carbon, and use cleaner and more energy-efficient pre- and post-production processes. And finally, low-income countries can play a proactive role. They can bypass high emissions development paths by avoiding the mistakes of the past. They can preserve and restore their forests, and they can improve agricultural practices through climate-smart agriculture techniques. So that's it for me for now. Later, we're going to hear from my colleague Alex Lach, who's going to talk about the detailed recipe in the report for getting to net zero emissions in the agri-food system. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bill. Gosh, only 4% of climate finance goes to agri-food. I can't go over that statistic. So I'm going to kick off now our series of Ignite talks. These are the kind of lightning talks focused on big picture challenges and solutions for how to get the agri-food system to net zero fast. Scientists give us the evidence to evaluate a problem which is essential if we have any hope of solving it. Our next speaker has done really groundbreaking work on measuring greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. I'd like to introduce Cynthia Rosenzweig. She is Senior Research Scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and laureate of the 2022 World Food Prize. Welcome, Cynthia.
Good morning. I want to thank the agriculture and food team at the World Bank for creating this important report, recognizing the crucial role that food system emissions play in climate change. In my 7 minutes, I've been asked to review to share with you the science of climate change and agriculture in 3 slides. That's quite a challenge, since I've spent decades working on this. But I've narrowed it down to 2 challenges and 2 solutions. And I need a clicker. Thank you. Here we go. All right. The first challenge, right here in the center of this slide. These are the global surface temperatures from late 1800s to last year. 2023 was the warmest year on record, and I highlighted there that the 1.7 was the October was 1.7 degrees warmer than the late 1800s. So we are already pushing up into that 1.5 degrees C target set by the Paris Agreement. So the urgency of all of this, of all of the climate change, is now truly upon us. But for agriculture, it's not the global surface temperature that matters. What matters is the extreme events. And I've put some examples around the global temperature graph. For example, in Pakistan, August 2022, I know the World Bank was deeply, deeply involved in that crisis. But in Europe too, in one of those high-income countries that Bill was just talking about, look, summer 2022, these are the soil moisture graph, this map showing huge heat waves, soil moisture deficits, massive effects on agriculture. Even though those were the 2022s. 2023, here we have the cyclone Mocha in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And the projections show that the most severe hurricanes and tropical cyclones are projected to increase with climate change. Finally, China, last August, last summer, massive floods affecting agriculture. So it's not just the global temperatures that we're looking in the middle, it's the increases in frequency, intensity, and duration of the extreme events, which are posing the tremendous challenge of multiple breadbasket failures now are on their way. Lloyd's of London in 2015 did a report on the food shocks. It was very prescient. And look back at that study and you'll see these things that were projected then are happening now. Let's go to the second challenge. The second challenge is what this report is focused on. At the same time, we have these massive impacts of climate change on the food system. We have the food system creating the vicious cycle that Bill just talked about. So here's another representation of the food system. So you see the part that was presented in a circle by Bill. We see that this food system approach has really taken hold now. Before, we just focused on the production side. Then probably still, more than 95% of impacts of studies on climate change were just focused on production. But now we have this much wider view which has taken hold, which is so important because for countries, they need to, as they're thinking about what to do about their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, they need to think about, well, which parts are the most important, and the report gives guidance. So we put just on some yellow stars, which for these, not every single box of these or activities in the food system are the same. So identifying which are the most effective and the most cost-effective ways. I know the bank that's a key part of what the bank does. Is very important. So we see, of course, these are the largest emitters, as we just saw, especially the deforestation, absolutely critical. In the production, of course, the livestock production, which was mentioned, we have to do a big focus on that. But also the interactive role of diets and consumption is also very important in regard to where possible, where people have food choices, to think about food choices on the diet and consumption side. And of course, the waste that Jürgen highlighted so importantly. So this is the second challenge, operating at the same time as the increasing extreme events on the food system, as well as it's being a major causative sector for climate change. Okay, let's turn to the two solutions. The first one is, and I'm going to cite, I believe it's attributed to, he was our mayor in New York, Michael Bloomberg. Very famous quote, we believe is attributed to him. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So the first solution that I'm proposing is much better accounting of the food system emissions. And we would like to work with the bank, our Food Climate Partnership and AgMIP would like to work with the bank to really encourage the IPCC to establish guidelines of best practices for accounting with this food system approach. The final solution is on the right. It has been mentioned, but I want to emphasize that we must act on the two challenges simultaneously and work not only on mitigation but adaptation at the same time. It's really all one system. And we need to then, we can see, this was work by the IPCC, where there's a blue star and a yellow star. The blue is for positive adaptation for more than 25 million people, soil organic carbon, increased productivity, agroforestry, for example, and then that had simultaneous mitigation potential of more than 3 gigatons. So with that, we have these massive challenges in the agri-food system, but we also now are really in the solution phase. And what's so really great about the work of the bank is that it's really motivating the implementation phase, which we are now in regard to climate change solutions. Thank you.
Many thanks to Cynthia that definitely delivered on the big picture framing. Really exciting to see, though, the potential that mitigation in the sector offers. Our next speaker will be coming to us remotely. I would like to introduce Eliane Ubalejoro. She is Chief Executive Officer of the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. Agriculture is the lead driver of deforestation, and forests and soils, as we just heard, are major players in the battle to get our food systems to net zero. Ms. Ubalejoro is, I think it's Dr. Ubalejoro, is a leading sustainable development expert who can talk more about that today.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining. I'm joining from Nairobi today. Thank you so much for having me with you. It's a pleasure to speak at this critical event alongside Cynthia, Robin, and Pierre. Bringing together creative minds to solve challenges is really one of our greatest strengths, and food system transformation is one of these critical challenges. As some of you may know, I was born in Rwanda, where I spent a lot of time in the countryside with smallholder farmers enjoying the beauty of forests. And I remember how green everything was, how lush and how little dust there was in the air. Decades later, the same area has seen genocide, deforestation, soil degradation, and there was dust everywhere. Regreening efforts are bringing back landscape health. This is not an uncommon story in terms of land degradation. 65% of soils in Africa are degraded. And when soils are degraded, we lose our resilience and we lose food security. And this can be reversed. Just as Rwanda has fought to bring back biodiversity, focus on green growth, and find harmony across the country, so too can communities around the world. And I'm here to tell you we cannot have a conversation about transforming food systems without talking about trees. One of our greatest solutions is agroforestry. Leveraging the power of trees on farms is really critical. When implemented at scale, agroforestry can increase food security for 1.3 billion people. It can reduce soil erosion by 50%, and it can increase soil organic matter by 21%. Plus, it can contribute to significant emission reductions and healthy biodiverse ecosystems. And agroforestry is catching on. About 85% of nationally determined contributions now mention agroforestry as a strategy for achieving targets without external financial support. This new report from the World Bank adds to this, showing one of the easiest ways to reduce emissions is to stop cutting down forests for productive land. The message is clear: protecting existing forests, restore forests, and manage forests. People often ask, how can we feed the world and protect forests? Can we do both? The answer is a resounding yes. We can feed the world and protect forests by integrating sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices based on science and robust data. This requires working with farmers to build incentives for new practices, to enhance productivity on their farms, and to engage with evidence. This is much of the work we do at C4ICRAF, putting participatory research for development in action on the ground with communities. Change is hard. Even when governments and companies embrace change, they require help to work across sectors, disciplines, and data to address complexity. At C4ICRAF, we bring cutting-edge research insights into development actions to guide stakeholders across the value chain and across sectors. How do we implement it? Well, by helping countries and farmers deliver. An example is in the Gambia, we have worked closely with the Environment Ministry to develop the first of its kind national agroforestry strategy. Consequently, over 1,000 smallholder farmers in the Gambia have adopted farm-level agroforestry protocols. This is the power of convening groups deeply committed to transformative change. Just this week, here in Nairobi, we met with the Deputy President of Kenya and colleagues from across ministries of health, agriculture, climate change, and water. We strategized on how to deliver on His Excellency President Ruto's 15 billion tree agenda, acknowledging that these trees will be planted on farms and contributing to a new economy and security for farmers. However, challenges remain. As the report points out, 3/4 of agri-food emissions come from low to middle income countries, including 2/3 from middle income countries. Unfortunately, not enough money is invested in these holistic strategies that cut agri-food emissions. This sector lags behind others in financing for climate action, even when we have investable solutions that can catalyze green growth. For example, in Kenya, we see new tree-based economies that can generate 10 times more revenue than tourism brings in. Too often, these solutions are left out of the conversation. However, fortunately, we have tried and tested solutions that are working on the ground, and this helps shift the conversation. Projects like Regreening Africa, recognized as a World Restoration Flagship at UNEA this past February, demonstrate the power of farmer-led regeneration to heal the planet. And healthy soils, the foundation for functioning ecosystems, including sustainable agricultural systems, is critical in this. C4ICRAF is home to state-of-the-art soil spectroscopy lab and a global database of ecosystem health indicators, one of the world's best tools for large-scale and accurate soil analytics. By assessing land and soil health, we provide analysis at farm, landscape, and global levels. What we need is partnership and funding to scale these solutions and make sure they reach those who need them most. If we are to transform our food systems to be climate resilient and sustainable, the change begins both on the ground in grassroots initiatives, through national policies and frameworks, and through global initiatives. Every corner of our globe should have equal access to scientific advancements that can improve lives and safeguard our planet. It's an investment in the future of our planet and a commitment to addressing the pressing challenges of our time while partnering with brilliant minds from around the world to lead the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliane, for a great talk about the potential of agroforestry and sustainable agriculture. I think anyone in this room knows capital ultimately drives transformation. That includes private capital. What are the opportunities ahead of investors? What are the challenges? To answer those and some other questions, today we have Robin O'Brien, founder of Replant Capital. She's an author, entrepreneur, and investor. Welcome to the stage, Robin.
Well, thank you to all of you for being here. Capital is the very first ingredient in any food system. My entire career has been at the intersection of food and finance. I am the oldest of four. My dad is from the South, my mother is from New Zealand. I have dual citizenship. When I went to business school, I went on a full scholarship after graduating top of my class. As an undergrad, I graduated top of my class in business school. I was a Fulbright fellow in Paris. And when I got into the finance world, I was on a team that managed $20 billion in assets. I was the only woman on the team, and so the guys said, "You're going to cover the food industry." I couldn't cook. I drank Diet Coke probably 6 times a day. I was not a food person. I thought, what in the world are you guys doing? You don't know what you're doing. I didn't have a choice. They said, "You're covering food." And so in the early years of my career, I really learned the financials. It was just black and white. My heart was not involved at all. A few years later, we started our family. I have 4 children now, between the ages of 19 and 24. My youngest child had a life-threatening allergic reaction. All of a sudden, I'm saying, what's going on in the food system? To really understand what's going on in the food system, you have to understand the financials. You cannot separate these things. We have a broken extractive food system because the financial system behind it is extractive, period. That's it. Part of the reason the financial system is so extractive is because it is so incredibly homogeneous. You look at these panelists today, there is nothing like that in the financial system. You would never see that. The financial system is 98% white male. So when we talk about biodiversity, and the word diversity is actually tucked into the word biodiversity, it's completely lacking in the financial system, completely lacking. We have monocropping, we have monoculture in our agricultural system because we have monobanking. We have monobanking in the private sector. It is completely homogeneous. And if nature has taught us anything, It's that homogeneous systems will fail. Every other species in nature, every single other species, the balance of the masculine and the feminine is absolutely beautifully calibrated so that it is sustainable. As a human species, we've missed that. In the financial sector, it is completely missing. So as a woman who has spent her life in this sector, to really come to this understanding that I now hold today, that that is the opportunity. How do we reimagine the financial system so that we can do all of these things? Because this data keeps coming out year after year after year after year. Last year, the World Bank issued a report, Detox Development, repurposing environmentally harmful subsidies. $7.3 trillion of environmentally harmful subsidies. In the agrochemical sector, fossil fuels and fisheries, $7.3 trillion. Literally, we are subsidizing the destruction of the planet. It is insane. $7.3 trillion. Our farmers in the United States carry $535 billion of debt. You go around the world, farmer debt is resulting not only in a loss of young people wanting to go into farming because they're looking at their parents saying, why do I want to take on that debt? Why do I want to expose my children to these chemicals? Why do I want to go into this as a profession? So they're opting out. Farmers call it a generational security crisis. Suicide in the farming population from the United States to India is one of the top leading causes of death. It is the highest demographic for suicide. In the United States, farmers are. So we've got $7.3 trillion in subsidies, $535 billion in debt. We literally have financed the destruction of the planet. It's insane. And when you poll S&P 100 companies, 93% of those companies say climate change is real. 93%. That's a pretty strong consensus. A third of those same companies will lobby against any of these measures that you're seeing on the screen today. That's corporate suicide. So what are we doing? The Food Systems Economic Commission issued a report that says there are hidden costs in this food system of $15 trillion. Climate, human health, nutrition, deforestation, $15 trillion of hidden costs. Again, we got to talk about the math. None of this works without the math. So what's the solution? Because this is the kind of stuff where you kind of want to jump off a cliff. Like, what are we going to do about this? In 1988, there was a piece of legislation passed. The Business Ownership Act for Women. It is the first time that women could take out a loan for a business. In 1988, I was in high school. I was not paying attention to this. That women could take out a loan and start a business without a husband or without their dad. That shift economically is so important. So in 1988, while that was happening, while none of us were paying attention, or few of us were paying attention, there is also something that is about to happen called the Great Wealth Transfer. $30 trillion is going to change hands into the hands of women for the first time ever. $30 trillion, that's the size of our GDP, going into the hands of women. We don't invest the same way. We don't shop the same way. We've seen incredible transformation in the way that we shop over the last 15 years. That transformation in the food system is driving this demand today. That same transformation is coming to finance, where women are emerging as financial leaders. Women will be emerging as investors for the first time ever. And when they invest, they are looking for impact. The opportunity is huge. So how do you invest? We got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I invite you to consider scope 0. Scope 0 are the lobbying dollars spent by any corporation on climate. It is a leading indicator for how serious they are. They can tell you these things and put out press releases and say all these wonderful things. Look at their lobbying spend. Scope 0 is how serious of a commitment they have to this work. The opportunity in front of us is huge. And I will invite you to consider that just as there's that story of two wolves, one on each shoulder, I think you guys have probably heard that, where one talks really well and the other tells you to do the bad thing, we have two compasses. One compass is love, the other compass is fear. Most of us use fear because it helps us navigate around our own shame, our own ego, whatever role we may have played in this. It will not solve the problem. When you use love, when you come from that place of what is actually in the best interest of these future generations, it will lead us to the solutions together. NATO says that we have to spend 2% of our GDP. 2% of GDP has to be spent on military defense. Of that 15 trillion hidden cost damage, the cost to fix that is $500 billion. That is 0.2 to 0.4% of our GDP. So if NATO's saying spend 2% on military, only 0.2% would provide the funding we need to be part of the solution. So I will leave you with this. With NATO, with the leadership of the World Bank, which represents a diversity that is so missing in the financial sector, with that leadership, to call on NATO, to call on other organizations to commit 0.2% of global GDP to transform our food system. Because redesigning the food system is the most important defense project globally of our time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin. As a climate journalist, I love this concept of scope zero. I might have to borrow that, if you don't mind. Arguably, it's people who work in the kitchen who have an outsized role to play in shaping consumer preferences around food. How are healthy food choices related to the broader climate agenda? We have the perfect speaker to speak to that. I'd like to welcome Pierre Thiam. He is a chef, author, social activist, and CEO of Teranga. Pierre?
Thank you. Good morning. When I first arrived in New York in the late 80s and started working in kitchen, it was very exciting to be a young cook in the so-called food capital of the world. But there was one problem. My food of origins, Africa, was absent of that world. And to me, I saw it as an opportunity. The luscious stews, eforiro with leafy cassava, the ndambe with black-eyed pea and sweet potatoes, the akara, and all of those wonderful flavors of West Africa, Senegal, Nigeria, were absent. So that was, to me, really a big opportunity in New York City where people were open to these cuisines, would be open to these cuisines. Eventually, that journey led me to opening restaurants, writing cookbooks, and that's when I really saw the really even bigger opportunity as I'm writing cookbooks and thinking of substitutions for recipes, for ingredients. Those ingredients that made la cuisine, that made Senegalese, West African cuisine, are really not accessible to the readers of my cookbooks, to my audience, really. And that opportunity started to ask that question, why is it that these ingredients that are grown in small farmers' communities in West Africa, ingredients that could change, transform those communities because they are the poorest in the world, those small farmers' communities. But in addition, those ingredients happen to be climate smart, happen to be resilient. They've been around for thousands of years. These ingredients happen to be very nutritious as well, and they don't have access to market. So this was the biggest dream. I've said, why shouldn't I be able to introduce crops like fonio? And fonio, that grain that you probably never heard of, that's been growing for 5,000 years in Africa, that's drought resistant, that grows in an area called the Sahel, south of the Sahara, where nothing grows. Fonio became the first ingredient, first platform for this company that we started called Yolele. Yolele is an African food brand with a vision to bring crops that are called lost, crops that are called orphans, that are grown by small farmers in these parts of Africa that could not only bring economic opportunities, but also give us access to a diet that's diversified. As Robin said earlier, and Cynthia mentioned it, diversity is really the solution. It's the name of the game. And the food system that we live in is a big problem because it has limited our diet to a very limited number of crops, three grains really, rice and corn and wheat. And we're ignoring thousands of other crops, particularly in Africa. And this is why I'm insisting about Africa, and Yolele became that company, because Africa is the place that is going to feed this planet. It has 60% of the world's arable land, and it still has hundreds of those other crops that need to be integrated in our food system. And the way we decided to do it with Yolele was to start at creating a demand, to create a brand. And today, 5-6 years after we started launching our first product, Fonio, we are distributed across the US at Whole Foods, at Target, Sprouts. So we're having an increased demand for Fonio, especially from millennials and Gen Zs who are conscious consumers. But we also were able to enter the snack category. In addition to having our Fonio and our Fonio pilafs, we have Fonio chips now. So you can enjoy the Fonio chips without even having to be in the kitchen. So you can snack on it. Even better, we introduced it as an ingredient to the brewery industry. And this is where you really have an impact. When other industries, such as Brooklyn Brewery that started with us, but today we have 9 other breweries that even launched a movement called Brewing for Impact that includes Carlsberg, Guinness. And this year, and even a brewery in China, this year they're going to launch limited editions of Fonio beer. And now that we've created this demand, it's important that we make sure Fonio doesn't become the next quinoa, and that's very important. We make sure that Fonio remains a crop that supports and that is grown by small farmers in Africa. That's important. We will have to make sure that Fonio doesn't become that cash crop that only farmers grow now because they have a market for it. And when that happens, we are back to that same monocultural system that Cynthia was talking about just now. Robin just mentioned it. That system that got us into the mess that we're in right now. That system that is the reason why the food system, modern food system, is responsible for 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emission. That's what we want to stay away from. We want to go away from monoculture by supporting those small farmers, by supporting the whole ecosystem. What we want to Yolele do is to not only bring Fonio into the market, but also bring other crops that are grown in rotation with Fonio. Bambara groundnut, a bean that tastes like peanuts without the allergens, but that's been grown in rotation with Fonio for thousands of years, but it's disappearing now. We need to bring it back. We need to open market for that. We need to open markets for crops like baobab leaves. It's not a crop, it's a leaf. Baobab leaves, moringa, and many others. That's the mission that we are setting, but we need also support of institutions like the World Bank. We need government support. We need to support the small farmers in better agricultural practices. They need aggregation centers so that they can respond to that demand. They need to invest in refrigerations, in warehouses, in elevating the standards of processing so that the waste, the food waste, is diminished, which is terrible with Fonio. It's actually close to 50% of food waste. So that needs to be addressed. But tackling those challenges will result in not only reaching that goal of net zero by 2050, it will help on that because Africa will play a big role in it, but it will also be a win for the environment. Like I mentioned, they are climate smart crops. It will be a win for the consumers who have access now to a wider diversity of food products, which is better for our health as well, because all those chronic diseases we are facing today right now are directly connected to the food system that's limited our diet. So this is what Yolele is doing, and this is what we want you to think about, starting to create a demand for these crops instead of letting them disappear. Biodiversity is dwindling at an alarming rate. We have lost close to 90% right now of the world's food biodiversity, and we need to address that. We need to stop the bleeding, and the way to stop the bleeding is to open markets for these crops that are here and that are underutilized. And the solution is all of us in our hands. It's not going to take a chef, it's going to take a community, bankers, governments, doctors, research, and ultimately the community must be the deliverable. So it starts with the small farmers. Thank you.
Big thanks to Pierre, and if anyone hasn't tried Fonio and would like to, I know for a fact they do sell Yolele brand Fonio at some Whole Foods in the DC area. So I would recommend it. So it's now time well, actually, before we transition to our panel, let's have another round of applause for our really wonderful lightning speakers. Okay, so we're setting up for our panel, and we have 5 really esteemed experts with different fields of deep knowledge on this issue. I guess I'll call them up. 3 of them are joining us, are here in the room, and 2 of them are joining us remotely. Our first panelist is Gunhild Stortelen. She is the CEO of the EAT Foundation. We're also joined by Usman Badian. He is the founder and executive chairperson of Academia 2063. Next, we have Ashish Prasan. He is a senior agricultural economist at the World Bank, and he is a co-author of Recipe for a Livable Planet. And then tuning in from overseas are Lord Nicholas Stern of the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. As well as Elizabeth Nsimadala, a board member for the Africa constituency of the World Farmers Organization. So before we kick off, I think we've heard from our lightning talk speakers so many of they've summarized the big problems and the potential so well, and now it's left to us this small matter of how we actually get there. And some of our speakers also, offered some really concrete, great ideas, but we're going to kind of focus on that pathway to transformation and to making change happen. Is this, yeah. This is on. Hi, so Gunhild, I was hoping we could actually start with you. We just heard from Chef Tiam about how bringing back traditional foods like Fonio can drive healthy and sustainable eating. Several years ago, EAT worked with The Lancet to define a planetary health diet. What does that look like?
Thank you so much. Before I explain that and also give a quick comment on the report, I want to say congratulations, because this is a huge landmark report, and it's so important that the bank now really puts the food system transformation next to the energy transition in terms of tackling climate change. The planetary health diets from the EAT Lancet, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it started out by asking what is healthy diets from sustainable food systems. And the researchers, they identified an optimal healthy reference diet and asked, is this possible for 10 billion people within planetary boundaries, all of them? And the answer was, yes, it is possible in theory. And since this is then both a healthy and sustainable diet, it was named the planetary health diet. And in short, it's a flexitarian diet, lots of colorful plant-rich foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, full meal, with modest amounts of meat and fish and animal proteins, and very little, if any, ultra-processed foods and added sugar. And it's a very flexible diet, so it will look different depending on where you are in the world. And it's so flexible that you can really adapt it to different cultures and even individual preferences, blue and green food systems. And it can be both a healthy omnivore, it can be a vegan, it can be a vegetarian diet. So it's really dietary patterns. And if this dietary pattern was applied globally, it could save 11 million lives a year. For this to happen, major changes are needed though. We would need to double production of healthy foods while halving production of unhealthy, including meats and sugar. And one important piece that was not addressed in the first Eat Lancet Commission was social justice. So this is partly why Eat Lancet 2.0 is now underway and will be published next summer, with social justice, meaning both an equitable distribution as well as a just transition, which is absolutely essential. And then the last final comment on the report. Again, it's a really important piece of work, but health is also incredibly important. Robin mentioned the Food Systems Economics Commission, which was inspired by your report, Nick, back in the days, looking into the cost of action versus inaction and also the political economy of food. Of the hidden costs, well, first of all, the food system is destroying more value than it creates, which is incredibly dramatic. But of these hidden costs, 70% is due to bad diets. And there are so many synergies between climate and other planetary boundaries and health. And by factoring in the health argument, and the cost estimates that is in the report is from Growing Better, that came out the same year as Eat Lancet. But the health costs are astronomical. And another argument that will strengthen the narrative and also get more people on board. Health is a universal argument. It's even more short-term. So let's not forget the health in this.
Absolutely. It's exciting to know about the follow-up to your initial report with the Lancet. That's great. Yeah, health is a very powerful argument. However, the fact is that, you know, around the world, a lot of the trend lines are going in the wrong direction. I recently read that the average American consumes 270 calories a day just in added sugar, right? Yeah, how do you have thoughts on how to drive, I guess I'm talking really about higher income countries with good food availability. How do you drive behavior change around something as sort of basically like psychological and fundamental as food?
Well, that's not easy, that's for sure. But we have seen how fast diets have been shifting. In my lifetime, 40, 50 years ago, my parents and our grandparents, they were eating very differently. So in just a couple of decades, the world has been flooded with ultra-processed foods. And we have also seen how fast new trends can happen. For example, sushi in the 80s. Sushi was introduced to Norway by a very clever marketing strategy by the Norwegian Seafood Council. And suddenly it was everywhere. And the same is now starting to happen with plant-based alternatives. So there are reasons to be optimistic. But obviously, as Jørgen said, we are subsidizing disaster and suicide, literally. And on top of that, we are also allowing aggressive marketing by big food. There are food oligopolies out there, massive unchecked corporate power. And unfortunately, most innovations, I mean, they are first and foremost profit-driven. So to really shift diets, which is essential, the Eat Lancet showed that it's not possible to stay within planetary boundaries, tackle climate change, without changing diets. And for this to happen, which the Food Systems Economics Commission is looking in depth into, countries and governments that have a very important role to play need to start bundling policies. They need to put policy packages together. There's no one size fits all. Important to say, this will have to be based on local realities, but even if it's a developing country or a high-income countries, the main ingredients are the same. So it's about supporting the shift to healthy diets. There has to be taxing of unhealthy foods. There have to be restricting of marketing. Public procurement can play a huge role. And government really needs to start walking the talk. And then there is about realigning incentives. Shifting subsidies, absolutely important. Support the goals of the food system transformation and start supporting a wide diversity of healthy foods. And then it's also about new taxes. We need to start tax carbon. We need to start putting a tax on nitrogen, which is another important source of pollution. And of course, innovation. We need to put a lot more R&D into this space, and also to make sure this becomes an inclusive transition. And the last piece, which also the Economics Commission stressed, was this will be, food prices can actually go up. And this has to be addressed. Safety nets is estimated to cost around 300 billion a year. But it's really important. We need to factor in the true cost of food, but we need to make sure that it becomes available and affordable and is not hitting poor people hard.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Ashesh. You're a co-author of this great new report. And so kind of turning from diets, although we addressed much more than diets just now, but to kind of the food production side of the equation. You said that investment needs to increase, I think, 18-fold, is that right? To get the world on track for net zero. Why has investment in this sector been so anemic?
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, that's a very important question, and one that actually quite surprised us when we looked at the climate finance numbers, that it was just 2.4% for the agri-food system, despite it accounting for 1/3 of emissions. And as Bill was showing earlier, without attacking food system emissions, we don't have any chance of hitting the Paris Agreement 1.5 target. Now, why do we have this problem in the first place? I think one of the first things we need to remember fundamentally from economics is that global public goods, there's a tendency to underinvest in them. And climate mitigation is the ultimate global public good. The benefits are a livable planet for our future generations. So ultimately, the investments are not for us. It is for the planet itself. And that there is an incentive to underinvest there. And how can we really change this incentive? I mean, I think what we are seeing globally is now increased awareness of the problem, and that is what our report is also trying to contribute towards. And with greater awareness, I believe there needs to be a shift in the way we think of the agri-food system. Too often we think of it as a victim of climate change, and it is, but it is also a system which can provide a lot of affordable, cost-effective solutions and get to net zero. And that is something that's often missing in the way a number of food system actors think of the system. In contrast, for example, clean energy is thought of as, our savior towards the climate transition. It is, absolutely. And that's a system which already we've seen change significantly. And it was easier to make that change. It was a more centralized system, clean power generation, distribution, these are more centralized systems. The agri-food system is highly decentralized. We are talking about 570 million farms, 8 billion consumers, agribusinesses, banks. Everyone is in this system together, and we need total collective action to actually make it move. So I think recognizing those challenges, what I do find empowering from the report is some of the main findings tell us that climate action can be actually quite targeted. 3/4 of cost-effective mitigation solutions are from middle-income countries. 62% are from just 15 large countries. So there is a strong case for focused climate action. And how do we get there? Often, in terms of climate finance, will involve, of course, governments shifting the way they provide support to the sector. We've talked about $600 billion. A lot of it is towards inputs and also very emission-intensive outputs. So inputs being fertilizers, pesticides, water, energy. The more we subsidize these inputs, the more we are actually increasing the amount of land degradation as well as emissions from the sector. Similarly, on the output side, a lot of countries subsidize rice, beef, sugar. These are highly emission-intensive products. So we need to shift the way we support the sector, and that involves moving towards incentives for adopting new low-emission technologies. And I believe that governments can do this also at the high level of climate commitments with NDCs. And then private sector players really also have to have a different approach to the sector. Until now, as I was saying, they haven't really considered the sector to be a source of emission reductions. That needs to shift with more patient capital going towards the sector.
I wondered if you could talk about, what are some of the costs and risks that farmers in developing countries especially face on the ground that makes kind of system change so challenging?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all recognize that farming is an inherently risky business. And climate change has just compounded those risks big time. Whether it's pests, diseases, drought, floods. As we know from Cynthia's presentation, this is the intensity, duration, severity of all these shocks have gone up significantly. Agricultural productivity has gone down by 21% since 1961. That's about 7 years of productivity gains. We've completely erased that. And when we think of how farmers can adapt to climate change, that's where there has to be a conscious, careful thinking around the costs and risks that you're asking me about. Some of the main new technologies and practices that exist for reducing emissions, for example, for rice, switching from continuously flooded paddy production systems to intermittent flooding of paddy fields, what we call alternate wetting and drying, or SRI systems, can completely cut methane emissions by large amounts in rice systems. They also increase yields and incomes in a number of different locations globally. But all this is over a medium term. In the short term, the farmer faces upfront costs of actually establishing this new system. It requires more labor, requires more upfront investments. And they don't know what happens in that season. If there is a drought, if there is a climate shock that they're hit with, suddenly, they lose interest in trying to do this and go back to what they were doing earlier. So I think we really need to have systems in place which incentivize behavioral change, adoption of new technologies, and that can come through from both the public side and the private side.
Great, thank you. I wanted to turn now to Usman. What are the main challenges at the country level in Africa, since I believe that you work quite a lot with African governments?
Thank you. Let me first say congratulations to you and your co-authors for a very interesting book, actually. talking about a very complex matter, but in very, very simple ways. I like the pragmatism of the report and the solutions. Very clear, very concise, easy to understand. It's going to be a very usable report, I think, for a lot of people. It's not a given. It's not obvious that it will turn out that way, but it's really great. I enjoyed reading it. When we look at Africa and we talk about the climate issue here, one thing that sets Africa apart is the high level of vulnerability to all of this, which is high exposure and low readiness in terms of climate change. So if anybody would like to see something done about climate change, that should be African countries. But of course, doing that has a lot to do with the kinds of technologies that will allow you to find new ways of doing business that is much more sustainable and environmental friendly, but also having the resources to do that. Talking about agriculture and the food system, there's something else that sets Africa apart that's going to be quite important. We've done simulation work looking at the next 10, 15, 20 years, different climate scenarios, and what's going to be the impact on African economies at the macro level, GDP growth, employment, poverty, nutrition, and the like. And it happens, most of us will expect probably to be the case, that agriculture is the entry point to everything else. The biggest trigger to macroeconomic impact of climate change go through the effects in agriculture. We're not even talking about doing something for emission reduction in agriculture, but just because how agriculture is disrupted by climate change, the entire economy is suffering. You don't have that in many other economies. So that means that when it comes to African countries, there's an opportunity for multiple wins. While you're fixing agriculture to reduce emissions, this is the opportunity to also make agriculture much more resilient to future climate change. You don't have that in many places, okay? We have looked at the impact of climate change in a country like Mali, like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Senegal, and you say, if this is the impact it's going to be on agriculture, and this is how it's going to be affecting the macroeconomy, what can you do to compensate for that as you go? And these are entry points for acting and then bringing interventions to reduce emissions. We saw that in each of those cases, there's a large share of crop land that will have to be invested in different types of innovations that will reduce emissions or make agriculture much more resilient. The share of cropland that has to be covered by improved varieties, the share of cropland that has to be covered with improved soil and water conservations, the share of cropland that has to be covered with new water irrigation systems. You can look at interventions you can do in agriculture to reduce the vulnerability to climate, and those are the entry point for you as an African country to look at new ways of doing business while dealing with climate change to also reduce emissions.
So you're saying it's there's multiple realms of benefit here to taking these steps that go far beyond emissions reduction, but obviously include that. Yeah. Thank you. I want to turn now, since we're talking about agriculture in Africa, to Elizabeth, who advocates for farmers there. Can you talk about some of the common kind of pain points for people growing food in African countries? Maybe when governments or NGOs draw up plans, but it's difficult to maybe make them work on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a great honor for me to speak at this important event. And let me start by sending you virtual hugs from Uganda and also joining colleagues to welcome the report and its findings. It's very important to recognize the crucial role that agri-food systems play as a huge untapped potential in climate mitigation, as well as in adaptation efforts. But before I respond to these pain points that you asked me to, I would like to first paint a picture of what climate change means for farmers like myself and the millions that I represent, and why we are critical to the agri-food system transition. We all know too well the impacts of climate change on our livelihoods. The previous speakers have already spoke about the impacts. My brother Badiani really painted the picture on the continent. But also when we look at the occurrences of the new pests and diseases, the fall armyworms, the desert locusts, the recent droughts in the Horn of Africa, the recent floods, just the recent ones in East Africa, they have all destroyed thousands of hectares of cropland and killed livestock, with warnings of food shortages across the region. And what does this mean? It means that when family farmers' livelihoods suffer, the ripple effects at a local level, national and international, is at a very big scale. So in terms of the pain points, firstly, for me, I think part of the answer is in the question itself. Why are governments and NGOs drawing up plans without farmers at the heart of the decision-making and in the planning process? Because we all understand that much as agri-food systems are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, but they also have untapped potential in terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change. So most of our government's consultation process are usually not inclusive, and they are not transparent, and as well as it is enshrined in most of our government's constitutions. So the decisions are usually made way before public participation happens. And these decisions are mainly based on interests, on influence, and promises by shoddy actors unknown to the real agriculture sector. A case in point that you've pointed out are the NGOs, which normally are not accountable to the farmers. They have no farmer constituency, nor do they understand the farmer's plight. But they are given so much leverage and space in such decisions. And that's why, for me, many of these plans are unknown to the farmers, thus making it impossible to monitor, to track, but also to report on them. So in our view, such funds get wasted. They do not follow the Paris Agreement on effective, efficient, and coordinated donor funding efforts. And they do not reach the perceived beneficiaries, and without results. Such funding pathways risk being discontinued, making the vulnerable even more dire. That's why I really welcome the World Bank's report focus on inclusion as one of the 6 pillars of the enabling framework, which the study outlines. So if our governments and institutions like the World Bank are serious about transforming our food systems, reducing emissions and building resiliency, they must, and I want to repeat, they must not only ensure family farmers have a real say in how climate plans are designed, but must intentionally develop instruments through which these farmers can access resources directly, because that is the biggest challenge for us as smallholder farmers. I think Bill has clearly elaborated on the statistics in terms of financing that reaches agri-food systems. And we all know that the world's over 600 million family farmers are literally the experts in our fields. But too often we are ignored by policymakers, we are overlooked by the funders and donors, or we are tagged as an afterthought when it comes to project plans. We are viewed as project beneficiaries, and as a result, we are also looked at as disseminators of results. So everyone looks at us as if we are waiting for handouts. And all we are asking for is for us to be treated as eco partners in the agri-food system. Our family farmers organizations hold on to generations of indigenous agriculture experience. We have the expertise when it comes to agriculture practices. We have the power to leverage on impact at scale. Through our millions of members at continental level, I represent more than 50 million smallholder farmers. And we are trusted as disbursers of finance. And this has happened during times of crisis. So as farm organizations, sustainable and resilient food systems are part of our DNA. That one you cannot take it away. We are training our farmers on how to adapt agroecology, regenerative agriculture, to practices like climate smart agriculture. And we have a compendium of over 50 practices of our farmers in the field. But these are just few islands of success that need to be profiled and put to scale. And we need to see more investments in climate adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I like your language, islands of success, and I think now I want to bring in Nick to kind of ask, how we maybe make those islands into large land masses of a successful practice. We are unfortunately seeing a trend of countries backsliding on their climate goals. Some proposals to address agricultural emissions have met strong resistance. How steep is the political climb up?
Let me try to respond to that, Amanda, by describing what's involved in that political climb. Now, the first thing, if you want to generate a movement from A to B in communities, countries, and across the world, is to show that B is much better than A. And I think this tremendous report does that very well. It deserves to be a game changer, and I think we're trying here to help it begin to be a game changer. So showing that the way of doing things that is in our hands is so much better than the dirty, destructive, wasteful models that we followed up to now is absolutely crucial. And this report does it in a very strong, clear way. It shows that it's not only attractive, it shows it's feasible. It shows that mitigation, adaptation, and development come together. The System for Root Intensification of Rice, SRI, has been an example that's been here a few times in this discussion, and it's a very good one. So too, restoring degraded land, building out mangroves, all of those things, mitigation, adaptation, development together. And that story has to be told very strongly, that these are not horse races, these three things, mitigation, adaptation, and development with just one winner. They're things that are interwoven and have to be pursued together. This is truly part of the growth story of the 21st century, much more attractive and sustainable than what went before. But, and it's a big but, you have to invest a lot. And I think the 200 billion or so number that comes out of this illustrates that or shows that very well. It doesn't come from nowhere. You've got to invest to get there. And that investment has not taken place. And I hope this report helps it take place. Also, you're going to have not just the arguments, but examples. And Elizabeth referred directly to that, I think absolutely rightly. So developing early examples, I think, is very important. So showing that the destination is really attractive, well worth it. The questions then become, in generating this political momentum and overcoming the obstacles and the backsliding, Amanda, is how you actually do that. Well, the first thing is to identify potential gainers and losers. And that is absolutely fundamental. And there it needs work, it needs analysis, it needs an understanding of the route. And if you're going to change, then change involves dislocation. Dislocation will involve winners as well as losers, even though the aggregate looks good. And the challenge then is to help, and this is the second point, help get a credible package to those who might not otherwise support it. For a package to be credible, again, as Elizabeth said, the people who are being involved in all this have to be involved in creating the package. The German government very recently tried to withdraw support for diesel in agriculture. Not surprisingly, the tractors turned up in the big cities and they backed off. It's very important that there's a whole package of support, opportunity, helping with the skills and the capital in actually getting there. And people have to see that, the positive sides of those packages. They have to see it early. They can't be told, no, just wait and see. It's all going to be nice down the road. It has to be seen early. And as Elizabeth said, participation is very important to credibility. Credibility is crucial to the investment we need. The next part of the package has to be a really good agricultural extension. And actually, there's some very good examples. Going back to my very early career at the end of the 60s, I was involved in smallholder tea in Kenya. And the way in which soon after land distribution, after independence, smallholders were helped to invest in tea, mostly women on small plots. But it was really organized very well. The capital came through, the planting material, the collecting of the tea, and it really happened. But it was a major agricultural extension and finance organization. A few years later, in the 70s, I worked on wheat in Kenya. After Kenya, I worked on wheat in India and the green revolution there. Again, a package which involved not just the seeds, but also the help with investing in the irrigation, which was crucial to those new crops. So we know it can be done. The CGIAR has a good track record. Jürgen Bödler is the chair of that now, and he's pumping it up. And we really ought to be putting much more into the CGIAR. And the last bit is finance. It's a lot of investment. That investment has to be financed. And poor people face higher costs of capital. And that's where the development banks can be so important. And if I've got 1 minute left, Amanda, can I say where that finance should come from?
Go right ahead.
Okay. A lot of it will be private sector finance, where small farmers themselves, from their savings, will make the finance, but they can't do it alone. Or big farmers can make the savings, can contribute their finance. But it's going to need a very big increase in finance from the multilateral development banking system. I was part of a group chaired by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, which produced 2 reports last year, and the first of those was about the tripling of the flows from the MDBs. Now that can be done, without much input. It will need input from shareholders. It will need you sweating the balance sheets. It will need new sources of capital. But it could be funded by very modest capital increases going along with that. So the scale of the investment we need for the whole green transition, and where the agricultural part of the green transition has been so underserved, does involve a big expansion of the lending of the MDBs. Don't let anybody tell you it's expensive. It's not. The UK's contribution to this tripling could be about £300 million a year for 10 years. That gets lost in the small, in the United States could be 1 billion. 1 billion a year for 10 years, that kind of thing is absolutely feasible, and we should work to make it happen. But it's not just those flows. It is also, there's going to have to be some debt-free finance that to fund the dislocations, to really bring down the cost of capital. And I think that's ODA, it's IDA, it's the special drawing rights, it's new forms of taxation, which Laurence Toubiana is working on at the request of Mia Mottley and President Ruto and President Macron, and the philanthropies. But there's one source of finance which I think we can stress, and that's the voluntary carbon markets. These are major sectoral transformation. We need to have a system where these are voluntary carbon markets do not work project by project, because that's so difficult to make work. But you could buy a slice of a major program of transition of this kind if you were looking to make big firm looking to make to buy in the voluntary carbon markets. John Kerry's been pursuing that with the Energy Transition Accelerator. We can make that happen in agriculture as well.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a couple of, actually, I think it'll just be one question because we're running out of time for Usman. And then I think I'll pose the same question to Elizabeth because I didn't pitch you as many questions as I'd hoped. But that one question I'll ask both of you is, what would you like to see happen at COP29 or COP30? What for you would be an outcome that could really help drive things forward?
Thank you very much. I will just connect to what Lord Stone was talking about. In the report, you showed how little climate finance goes to agriculture, and of that little, how little goes to Africa. And I think Africa can be ready for climate finance. Your report is talking about forestry preservation and restoration being an entry point for a greater carbon sequestration and sink and contribution in developing countries. If we were to come at COP to a solution that allow us to get a system of fair value of forestry resources that could be used to trigger capital finance to get into Africa, I think nowadays it's possible to get the verifications and the tracking and the measurement that are necessary to be able to do that. We're currently at Academia 2063 using satellite data and AI to track greenhouse gas emissions across land cover and land use on a weekly basis and a bi-weekly basis. So we can construct the verification processes and the certification processes that allow capital finance to get into Africa, climate finance. And when it does, the technologies that you need to be scaled across agriculture to reduce emissions, the extension systems you need to go with it, the infrastructure you need to go with that, can be will apply this kind of finance to do that. So if COP can help us get to a place where more of the capital finance finds its way to Africa, then we can leverage that to finance the technologies, the institutional infrastructure, and the systems we need to reduce a trajectory on emissions, to make agriculture much more resilient, and get to the multiple win-wins that I've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth. Sorry, hopes for COP?
Yes. I think for me, what is very important for every COP, we always hear a lot of commitments and pledges in terms of resources. But I can say we are a constituency that always hear but never touch some of these resources. So we need to break down the barriers which prevent grassroots organizations such as my own, which supports millions of smallholder farmers to have direct access to financing, because this financing is needed desperately by the farmers. And this means ensuring more financing going directly to farm organizations where we have the most impact, and prioritizing long-term investment plans, projects, offering grants as well as loans, and ensuring that funds are flexible to deal with the unpredictability of farming life. And this can only be done by reforming the funding pathways, by introducing new instruments that farmers can leverage on. It can be by allowing more accredited entities or agencies, especially those that are agriculture leaning, to be enlisted. There's need to empower more development and agriculture banks to be recipients of the loans, because they work with us as farmer institutions, they work with savings and credit cooperative unions, and we need also to see affirmative action on the minimum allocation for the farmers annually. At least we need to see more than 50% of the funds that are provided for adaptation. And finally, there is need to diversify climate finance resources, provide for less stringent requirements for access by the farmers' organizations. But I wanted to point out, if you can allow me 1 minute, the need also to invest, the need to invest in innovations by smallholder farmers, because we're seeing a lot of innovations that are happening on the ground. And I want to point out one, and specifically, it's because it was supported by the World Bank funds under the Global Agriculture Food Security Program. And this is a farmer-led innovation e-granary initiative by the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, which was tried and really proven as a climate-smart agriculture program that leveraged more than 20 private sector partnerships from farm to the market and provided climate mitigation finance through risk mitigation and credit. So we mitigated against production and market risks and empowered farmers to make climate adaptation-related decisions around choice of enterprise, variety to grow, inputs, and agronomy. However, such projects like this, which show impact and have a potential, are only supported for short term, usually between 2 and 3 years. And they fail to create impact at the outcome level. So there is need for more resources for such initiatives that are farmer-led and that can achieve, sustainability at scale. And if I can use a metaphor from the recipe for a living planet, family farmers need to be the head chefs, not just sauce chefs, when it comes to cooking up this plan to make the agri-food sector net zero. Thank you.
That's actually a wonderful way to end.
Do we still have time for a couple of questions?
Let's make it 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can take a total of 2 questions from the audience for the panel. The gentleman in the blue shirt here.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for taking my question. I'm Hamish Taylor, I come from Scotland. I work in public-private partnerships on sustainable value chains. It's a question for the entire panel. We heard how food systems are both the victim of climate change and potentially the villain through deforestation.
Smart agriculture funding. And we are just getting started. I think this needs to go significantly, to the next level, especially in terms of mitigation financing. And we are already seeing this happen. In East Asia, for example, Vietnam is now engaged in a very large-scale program to bring in low methane rice practices to 1 million hectares. The World Bank is supporting this initiative. In Zambia, we are supporting an initiative to reduce emissions as well. And we've already done this in many other places. So we have expertise, but we really want to support. This is completely a country-led priority. So once countries make this more of a priority, the World Bank is ready to support in any way possible.
Gunhild?
Yes, I just wanted to add into what Nick said as well, that making this happen is obviously going to be challenging. It's totally doable and cost efficient, as we know. But it will require a much more participatory governance and also resources to help both countries and also actors like farmers to adapt. And I think here the bank could really leverage its sectoral expertise, ranging from climate-smart agriculture to design of social protection measures and also new skills systems to help different players adapt. So I really think that the bank can play a huge role going forward in making this possible. And the last thing I just wanted to clarify in terms of the Eat Lancet and the planetary health diet, which I started thinking about once I stopped talking, is really important to say, which the report also calls out. This is about rich countries having to reduce their overconsumption of meat and animal proteins, allowing, for example, countries in Africa to actually consume more, because that would help their diets be more healthy. So calling out the inequality and always have this social justice piece, which is what Eat Lancet 2.0 is going to be very clear about, by defining a social justice boundary for food systems. And this will mean that, again, rich countries have to clean up and get their own houses in order, and also play a huge part in helping the developing world making this happen.
Great, important distinction there, yeah. I think we have time for one more question over here.
Hi, Bob Tansey. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I'm struck both by the report and all the comments, but also the even greater potential for holistic solutions across biodiversity, lands, climate. I'm actually responsible through our membership, something called the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, to give recommendations on agriculture to China's leadership. One example, another is the opportunities for collaboration across different organizations for on-the-ground solutions in Latin America that avoid destructive sourcing and turn it into sustainable sourcing, and the potential of the Saudi convening the Lamb's Cup.
Sorry, we're quite crunched from time. If you could get to the question.
Just wondering if any of the panelists are also struck by holistic approaches that go beyond simply the all-important climate framing. Thank you.
I think, Amanda, can I say something very briefly?
Sure.
I think we've all been trying to tell the story, and the report does it, that this is good development, it's mitigation, and it's adaptation, and it's all wrapped up together. And that, I think, is the story. It's the growth story of the 21st century, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And I think that the report makes that very clear. So that the question has been answered, really.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to have to end on that note. Everyone, please thank our wonderful panel today. Those here and those afar. All right. Got multiple microphones. To take us out, we're going to actually have a healthy and sustainable food preparation demonstration in a few minutes, which I'm looking forward to. And to take us out, I'd like to welcome Alex Lotch. He is a senior climate finance specialist at the World Bank, and he's going to be talking about the way forward.
Let me just quickly rearrange the furniture. Good food and good conversation usually go together. That's almost universal around the world. We were very pleased to have such a good conversation about the report that we're launching today. We're very appreciative of the praise we got. We're very appreciative of the amplification of the messages we have in our report. That leaves me with a very Oh, it's back. See anything that could top what has already been said. I will now highlight a few more insights from our report and explain how they inform our actions going forward. What you see here is essentially the summary of our recipe. It shows the quantified ingredients that we need to prepare it and cook it. It is the recipe that shows the cost-effective, the affordable options that can transform the system from the polluting system that it is today to a system that plays a much more climate and planet positive role going forward. On the left, you see the green bar, the yellow bar that we saw earlier, the 16 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that the system puts out these days. Towards the right, you see a stack of actions. If you stack them up and you filter out the most cost-effective options across high, middle, and low-income countries, you can see they can bring down this massive amount of emissions over the next couple of decades. You also see a purple bar there on the right. Those are additional measures, technologies, innovations that are on the horizon that can bring us over that net zero line. We explain those in a great detail, but it includes actions like low emissions fertilizer, feed additives that we heard about for livestock, or cold chains powered by renewable energy. So it is doable, and it was resonated just now on the panel. It's a doable recipe. But why is it not happening? We have a substantial portion in our report that focuses on what we poetically call the 6 I's. We've kept hearing about them over the last 2 hours. Let me just highlight one of them in particular, inclusion. And I couldn't say it much more passionately than Elizabeth did just a moment ago. Inclusion is absolutely essential for this transformation. The transformation will not happen if it's not inclusive, equitable, and just. And it needs to bring along the hundreds of millions of farmers that are producing most of the food that is consumed by humanity. So absolutely essential. And that's one of the areas that is framing this. But as any good recipe, it needs to be prepared in the kitchen. So this is really the kitchen that we need, or as economists would call it, the enabling environment. There's other elements to it, other five more I's. Investments, needless to say, we need to bring down the risk to crowd in the private sector. We heard about that earlier to make this transformation possible. We need incentives, government to spend differently, more climate friendly, set policies. Institutions very quickly need to adjust both at the international level, at the national level, at that level of green jurisdictions, many of which are playing a pioneering role. And in this day and age of information and data, that's obviously particularly critical. We just heard it from Usman, the MRV, being able to measure our impacts, the impacts of our action. Cynthia said it earlier in the session as well. That is absolutely critical, not only to be confident they're moving in the right direction, but also unlock additional finance that could be brought in from carbon markets. Nick spoke to that point. And innovation. Needless to say, a big transformation needs innovation. A very distinct feature that is different from the agri-food system to the energy systems. We don't have a few single technologies like battery storage or photovoltaics that can drive the transition. We need solutions upstream on land use, on the farm, and downstream as food moves from the farm gate to the fork. Now, what we have seen as we've been writing the report is really a wave of will, if you want. We have seen that governments are coming together and they've made ambitious declarations 6 months ago at COP28 to make agri-food system transformation an integral part of the actions going forward. What you see here is really an indication, several measures of how over the last 5 years, the actions related to agri-food systems in countries' climate action plans in their nationally determined contributions have increased. We hope that this wave will continue to grow as we move forward. You saw these circles earlier, and the small little tartlet shown in green here that represents current climate finance. This amount needs to increase to a big pie of $260 billion, as we estimate, to be spent annually on protecting nature, making farms more productive, and clean up value chains. This is the 18-fold increase that we need to achieve going forward in mobilizing finance. If we do this, we can cut, according to our estimates, we can cut the emissions in half by the end of the century and put us on a path toward net zero by middle of the century. Nick very eloquently highlighted the benefits. The benefit-cost ratio of this transformation is 16 to 1. 16 times more benefits than the cost. $260 billion is less than half of what the world spends on agricultural, mostly harmful agricultural subsidies. So again, it's doable, the resources are there, the money is in the system, it needs to be redirected. Of course, countries will choose their own pathways towards that target. What you see here are some of the countries with most of the solutions within their economies. You see the distribution in terms of the size of the solutions that they can deliver and the distribution across the different components of the food system. For instance, Brazil and Indonesia, highly forested countries that are losing massive amounts of forest due to the expansion of agricultural commodities, could stop that trend and reverse it. A major gain, good for development and good for people on the ground. China, the United States, the European Union, for instance, as shown in yellow or in orange, can do a lot to shift harmful diets toward more low emissions diet. So the point here is countries will choose and are choosing their pathways towards this net zero transition that reflects their natural endowment, their economies, and their competitive advantage. Putting it all together, this is just a qualitative representation of what we have in the report. If all countries work together across all components in the food system, upstream on land use, providing clean inputs for agricultural production, making production more productive and efficient in terms of resource use, cleaning up the value chain all the way from the farm gate to the fork and nudging consumer behavior, we can make this transition. And it is possible, it is feasible, and it is affordable to reach the Paris Agreement targets in that way. We have quantitative estimates that allow us to map this opportunity to different parts of this food system and to different parts of these geographies. Now, going forward, and questions were just asked, what are we going to do as the World Bank? Now, we want to work together with all of you in the room and all of you connected online. Here are just a few highlights of what we want to do to turn the words that we have in our report into actions going forward. One set of activities relate to informing country action, really taking it down from the global level to the country level. The economics are there, but they're perhaps not specific enough to guide investments at the country level. We're working on that. We want to work with you on this. Food system climate action plans. Again, this idea of bringing down this type of analysis that we've now done at the global level down to the local level, engaging in processes with stakeholders at the local level, at the country level, a point that Cynthia made at the beginning of our session. That's something we want to do together. Increasing leverage. Partnerships, both internally and externally, is part of our engagement going forward. Internally, we've produced this report with many parts of the bank. Colleagues working on water, colleagues working on energy, behavioral and economic. Internally, with many of the partners here in the room and many of the partners connected here, this is obviously too big to do alone. Mobilizing finance, crowding innovative sources of finance is absolutely critical, and there are several ideas laid out in the report that we want to pursue. Now, all of this takes different thinking, different actions, and change. Now, one of the places that we're all familiar with and where we can make decisions, and again, we heard about this many times in this panel, is in the kitchen. We can decide what we eat, how we prepare it, and which section of the supermarket we go shopping in. Now, for those of you in the room, we have, or in the building, if you're still connected online, we have a special treat lined up for you to transform the words in our report into action. It's a modest step, but it's leading in the right direction. Chef Pierre, from whom you heard earlier, with an inspirational speech, talked very passionately about fonio and how it relates to the farmers in West Africa. That's what we have prepared for you. A cooking demonstration by Chef Pierre. He will be joined for entertainment value by our management and our panelists. He will get an apron and a knife and will join him in that cooking show. We will talk about the sourcing of these ingredients, their sustainability, their taste, and their importance of promoting livelihoods of farmers in West Africa. So that's our treat for you. We thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the questions. Do stay engaged, download the report, read it. We want to work with you, and we hope to take the conversation now from here into the kitchen. Bon appétit.